Ever wondered how people kept food from going bad before refrigerators existed? Think about it for a second. You wake up in medieval times and you've got a whole pig that needs to last through winter, but there's no fridge, no freezer, not even an ice pack, and ordering takeout. Well, that wasn't exactly an option back then. So what did medieval people do? They got creative. Really creative. Some of their preservation methods were absolutely brilliant. Some were totally bizarre. And honestly, a few were so gross, you'll be grateful you live in the 21st century. And here's the thing. Medieval kitchens were nothing like the clean, sterile kitchens we have today. Imagine walking into a room filled with smoke, with meat hanging from every rafter, herbs dangling everywhere, and enough salt piled up to make a pretzel factory jealous. These kitchens were hot, they were smoky, and they smelled like a mix of wood smoke, dried fish, and whatever was fermenting in the corner. But they were also the heart of every medieval home, the place where survival literally depended on knowing how to make food last. Because when winter came, you couldn't just run to the grocery store. You either had food stored up or you went hungry. It's that simple. The funny part is, medieval cooks didn't have any of the things we consider essential today. No plastic wrap, no canning jars, no vacuum sealers. Imagine trying to explain a Ziploc bag to someone from the 1300s, they'd think you were describing magic. But despite having none of our modern conveniences, they managed to keep food edible for months, sometimes even years. They figured out 7 main preservation methods, and each one is more fascinating than the last, so let's dive in. First up, we've got salt. And I'm not talking about the little shaker on your dinner table. Medieval people were obsessed with salt. Like, really obsessed? Here's a fun fact. The word salary actually comes from salt because Roman soldiers used to get paid in it. That's how valuable this stuff was. Fast forward to medieval times, and salt merchants in places like Venice were basically billionaires. They controlled the salt trade and made absolute fortunes. We're talking the medieval equivalent of tech entrepreneurs, except instead of selling apps, they were selling tiny white crystals that kept you from starving. So how did salting actually work? Well, they'd take meat or fish and just absolutely cover it in salt. We're talking about using 20% of the food's weight in pure salt. The meat would shrivel up and get hard, kind of like a raisin, except way less appetizing. But that was the whole point. Salt sucks all the moisture out of food, and without moisture, bacteria can't grow. So the food just sits there, preserved. One medieval recipe literally says to salt your meat until it looks like it's covered in snow, which honestly sounds like what happens when I accidentally knock over the salt shaker at dinner. They salted everything. Fish got packed in barrels with alternating layers of salt and fish, kind of like the world's most unappetizing lasagna. Pork turned into ham and bacon vegetables, especially cabbage got salted until they fermented. Into sauerkraut. Medieval doctors actually believed all this salt was super H. Healthy for you, which is hilarious considering what modern nutritionists would say about eating that much sodium. But here's the problem. Salt was expensive, like really expensive. A pound of good salt could cost as much as a week's wages for a regular worker. There's this great story about a French village that traded an entire flock of sheep just to get enough salt to make it through one winter. When you're trading livestock for seasoning, times are tough. But when salt wasn't available or was too expensive, medieval people had a backup plan that was equally genius: smoking. And when I say they smoked their food, I mean they literally turned their entire kitchen into a smokehouse. Imagine so much smoke filling the room, that you could barely see your hand in front of your face. If a medieval cook walked into a modern barbecue restaurant, they'd probably feel right at home, except medieval kitchens didn't have exhaust fans. Which means everyone who worked in there probably smelled like smoked bacon 24/7, though, honestly, I don't think anyone was complaining about smelling like bacon. The smoking process was actually really clever. They'd hang meat or fish way up high in the kitchen in special chimneys or from the rafters, and the smoke from the cooking fire would just constantly drift up and around it. The best part, they knew exactly which woods to use for which foods. Oak was for beef, apple wood for pork, and cherry wood for poultry. One German cookbook from the Middle Ages lists specific wood types for specific meats. Talk about being picky with your smoke. And here's a wild fact. Archaeologists found a medieval smokehouse from 1,375 inches, London, and the ceiling beams still smelled like smoke 600 years later. That's some serious preservation. Smoking did more than just make food taste good. The smoke created a protective layer on the outside that kept bugs and bacteria away. It was like an all-natural food force field. And they didn't just smoke meat, they smoked cheese, too. In fact, some of the most famous cheeses we have today, like smoked Gouda, started as medieval preservation techniques. They even smoked eggs and grains. My personal favorite detail. They sometimes smoked eggs. Imagine being a chicken and finding out your eggs are gonna smell like a campfire. The really fancy medieval households had separate smokehouses with different levels. The top level for light smoking like fish, the middle for medium smoking like pork, and the bottom, right near the fire, for heavy smoking like beef. It was basically a multi-level parking garage except for food. Now, smoking and salting were great, but what happened in the summer when it was too hot, or during seasons when you needed something fresher? That's when medieval people turned to nature's freezer, ice, and snow. And let me tell you, they got really creative with it. Wealthy nobles had these special buildings called ice houses. And these weren't some little garden sheds. These were serious underground bunkers designed to keep ice frozen. The biggest ice house ever found was at Hampton Court Palace, and it could hold 75 tons of ice. That's enough ice to make slushies for an entire army. Ice houses were built kind of like upside-down ice cream cone. They'd dig deep into the ground and build super thick walls. Some wealthy families even hired specialized ice masters, whose entire job was just keeping the ice from melting. Imagine putting that on your resume. Professional ice keeper. And the crazy part, these ice houses worked so well that they could keep ice frozen for up to 2 years. The secret, they packed sawdust between the layers of ice, which acted like medieval insulation. Your beach cooler has nothing on medieval ice house technology. But not everyone was rich enough to have their own personal ice fortress. So what did regular people do? They used caves and underground cellars. Natural caves stay at a pretty constant 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, which is perfect for keeping food fresh. Medieval people would store cheese, eggs, and vegetables in these naturally cool spots. Some monasteries even built artificial caves specifically for storing their wine and beer, because apparently monks had their priorities straight. The funniest part about medieval cold storage during winter parties, they'd literally pack perishable food in snow. Imagine being the party planner. Okay, we need wine-roasted pigs and enough snow to keep the fish fresh. Oh, and extra snow for snowball fights. They even served frozen desserts at fancy feasts. Basically medieval snow cones with honey or fruit juice. But winter doesn't last forever. And eventually all that ice melts away. That's when medieval folks had to turn to their next trick, drying absolutely everything. And I mean everything. Medieval people turned food drying into a legitimate art form. Meat became jerky, grapes turned into raisins, plums became prunes. They'd string up fruits and vegetables on long ropes and hang them from the rafters like the world's weirdest Christmas decorations. The whole house probably looked like some kind of bizarre food festival that never ended. But here's where it gets really interesting. They actually had special buildings just for drying food. These towers had open sides with wooden slats to let air flow through while keeping birds out. One famous drying tower in France could dry over 2,000 pounds of fruit at once. That's more fruit than most grocery stores keep in stock. Locals called these towers fruit castles, which is honestly a way better name than food dehydrator. Some of these towers still exist today, and archaeologists found bits of dried fruit stuck in the corners that are over 500 years old. Talk about ancient snacks. They had different drying techniques for different foods. Herbs got bundled and hung upside down. Meat was sliced super thin. The thinner the better, because nobody wanted to bite into half-dried beef and get a medieval stomachache. They even had special drying rooms with little windows that could be opened or closed based on the weather. It was like a medieval version of climate control. One cookbook from the 1300s says, "Cut your meat as thin as your patience during Lent." Another warned, "If your dried beef bounces when you drop it, you've done it right. If it shatters, you've basically created a weapon." Dried fish were especially hardcore. They'd beat the fish flat until it was practically paper thin. These dried fish were so hard, ULD probably used them as roof tiles. There's actually a story about Norwegian sailors using dried fish as plates, because why bring dishes when your food can be the dish? The best part about dried food, it was incredibly lightweight. The whole cow could dry down to the size of a modern backpack, which is why armies loved it. They could carry weeks of food without needing supply wagons. Medieval armies even had special officers called keepers of the dry stores, though that probably wasn't the most impressive title at parties. But sometimes drying wasn't enough, especially in humid or rainy places. That's when medieval people pulled out their secret weapon, vinegar, because the medieval world was absolutely crazy about pickling and fermentation. Couldn't walk into a medieval kitchen without bumping into barrels of fermenting vegetables. They pickled everything. Cabbage became sauerkraut, cucumbers turned into pickles. They even fermented fish. One German cookbook literally just says, "Put it in vinegar until it stops smelling like fish and starts smelling like regret." Some historians think medieval Europeans pickled more food per person than any other civilization in history. The science behind it is actually pretty cool. Fermentation creates good bacteria that fight off the bad bacteria that makes you sick. One barrel of sauerkraut could feed a family through winter and give them enough vitamin C to avoid scurvy. Medieval people were fighting off pirate diseases before pirates were even cool. Tests on surviving medieval recipes show their fermented foods had more beneficial bacteria than most modern and probiotic supplements. Some monasteries had entire rooms just for fermentation. Monks kept detailed records of their pickling experiments, which is how we know that one monastery in France pickled over 15,000 eggs in a single year. Imagine being that monk. "Brother John, what's your holy duty?" "Oh, I pickle eggs, thousands of them. My hands smell like vinegar, and I haven't tasted anything else in 3 years." And the monks wrote poems about it. There's one poem that goes on for 50 verses about properly fermenting turnips. But the real fermentation champions were the Vikings. They made something called lutefisk, which is fish soaked in lye, until it becomes jelly-like. Yes, you read that right. They turned fish into jelly on purpose, and considered it a delicacy. There's an Old Norse saying that translates to, "A brave man fears many things, but only a fool fears not the brave." Lutefisk archaeological digs have found Viking fermentation barrels with fish traces that are over 1,000 years old. Thankfully, nobody's tried to taste them. The best part, fermented foods actually got better with age. Some noble families had barrels of pickled vegetables they passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Here, son, take this sacred barrel of pickled turnips. Your great-grandfather's dying wish was that you keep adding vinegar to it. But if you wanted to preserve something really special, something that needed to last for years, there was an even sweeter option, honey. And here's the amazing thing about honey, it literally never goes bad. Scientists found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs that was still perfect. Teely edible, though. Maybe don't go tomb raiding for snacks. Medieval people knew about honey's magical properties and used it for everything. They'd pour honey over fruits, meats, even whole birds. One recipe suggests preserving an entire peacock in honey, because apparently regular chicken wasn't fancy enough. Medieval beekeepers were treated like rock stars. They had special legal protections and could even trespass on property if they were chasing their bees' records. From one English manor show, they paid their beekeeper more than their cook, which tells you how valuable honey was. A good beekeeper could manage up to 100 hives, producing enough honey to preserve food for an entire village. And they didn't just use honey for food, they used it for medicine. Got a cut slap? Some honey on it, can't sleep. Try honey and warm milk. Bubonic plague. Well, honey probably won't help, but they tried it anyway. One doctor prescribed honey water for everything from toothaches to broken hearts, though I bet the heartbroken patients would have preferred chocolate. Some medieval castles had special honey rooms, warm, dry spaces where they stored honey-preserved foods. The walls would get all sticky from honey drips, and bugs would get stuck to them like medieval flypaper. One castle's records complain about having to scrape the walls clean every spring because the honey rooms caught more flies than food. Rich people would preserve exotic fruits in honey just to show off. Oh, you've never had honey-preserved lemons from Sicily? How common they'd serve these at feasts, making everyone else feel bad about their regular pick. Lead turnips. The funniest part, they tested honey purity by dropping a chicken feather in it. If the feather sank too fast, the honey was too watery. One text warns, if your honey cannot hold a feather, it cannot hold your dinner. But what if you wanted to preserve something and make it fun at the same time? Well, that's where alcohol came in, because nothing says food preservation quite like drowning your food in wine. Medieval people discovered that alcohol wasn't just for getting drunk, it was an amazing preservative. Fruits, vegetables, even eggs could last for months. When soaked in wine or beer, one French castle went through over 100,000 liters of wine per year, and only half was for drinking. The rest went to preserving everything from cherries to whole geese. Their logic was basically this: wine keeps us feeling good, maybe it'll keep our food feeling good too. And they were absolutely right. Alcohol kills bacteria and prevents spoiling. The most popular treats were drunken fruits, basically medieval cocktail garnishes. They'd soak plums, cherries, and peaches in spiced wine until they became boozy little flavor bombs. One recipe warns, these fruits will make you twice as merry as regular fruits. They even preserved meat in alcohol, Though that was probably desperation more than anything. Nothing says we're out of options, like a chicken floating in beer. Here's a weird one. They preserved eggs, alcohol, cracking them into barrels of wine where they'd sort of pickle medieval taverns, served these boozy eggs as bar snacks because regular pickled eggs weren't interesting enough. There's a story about a merchant who ate 3 wine-preserved eggs on a bet and ended up singing tavern songs in Latin despite not knowing Latin. The really fancy folks got creative, layering fruits with different wines to create pretty patterns in storage jars. One noble family had a barrel where they preserved fruit in layers of red and white wine, making it look like a striped flag. Medieval Instagram material, right there. Records show some royal kitchens spent more on preservation wine than on meat, though knowing royalty, they probably drank half the supply anyway. And here's the best part. They figured out that stronger alcohol worked better for preservation, which led to enthusiastic research into distillation. No, my lord. I'm not making extra strong wine for fun. It's for preserving these very important royal pears. Yes, that's it. Royal pears. And there you have it. 7 brilliant ways medieval people kept food from spoiling: salt, smoking, ice, drying, fermentation, honey, and alcohol. They figured out how to survive without any of our modern technology. Next time you open your intermedi refrigerator, thank your medieval ancestors for pioneering these preservation techniques. Though maybe skip trying the wine-soaked eggs. Those sound like a mistake even by medieval standards.